Welcome. We'll get started. You've probably all heard versions of the story, an old and macabre story of two people on a bridge. One of them is an activist and the other is a physician. And they're standing over a river, a rather swift river, and they see dozens of drowning babies floating by in the river. And the physician jumps in, and she tries to save as many as she can. But the current is strong, and there's so many drowning that she's only able to save a few of them. Meanwhile, the activist goes upstream along the side of the river, looking for the thug who is throwing in these children into the water. But many doesn't drown while she is doing this. These questions of the relation between direct social service and working for social change, for societal change, come up in many places in this course, and they come up today. There are questions also that many of you have thought about as you do service in educational programs, in homeless shelters, the distinction between service and change. Does volunteer service simply enable governments to further cut taxes for their wealthy suburban constituents because students and often religious people are willing to do the same work for free rather than having the work done on a paid professional basis with tax support? In this service versus change spectrum, and we can argue whether it is a spectrum, most physicians are on the service side. But today's guest manages to do both and to show the interconnections between humanitarian service and social change. It is an honor to introduce today's guest, Dr. Jennifer Leaning, an expert on humanitarian crises, professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, an editor of Medicine and Global Survival, and a founder of Physicians for Human Rights. For today's interview, we have all read her article on public health, war, and terrorism. And I should mention that she called this morning to let me know that she has severe laryngitis, but that she didn't want to let that stop her from having a chance to meet all of you. And I'm grateful that she braved the pain of that to join us. So please join me in welcoming an international leader in response to human suffering, Professor Jennifer Leaning. And as usual, we'll begin with questions. And I thought for the first one to ask if you might reflect back on your own time as an undergraduate and how you see your interests and activities then in the light of what you observe of the university now.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here. Can you hear me? No. This may need to be louder. Can it get turned up? Is this better? Okay, great. Thank you. I do apologize for the quality of my voice and ask you to bear with me. I was here at Radcliffe, which, as probably you know, in the 60s and 70s, was in that process of moving from being a residential women's college with academics at Harvard to being resident with Harvard students and academics at Harvard. And so my entering class was the class of, I was class of 67, and I graduated in 1968. And it's a really different place now, I must say. Not because of the residential mix, although I'm sure that is an important aspect, but because of the academic life that I'm getting a sense of as I teach here, as I see undergraduates in a number of settings. I just finished a freshman seminar this last fall, the first time I've taught one of these with Jackie Baba, a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School. And so we had a chance to observe what life is like for at least 12 entering freshmen. And then other things that I've done in terms of sexual assault and mental health here for the undergraduate community make me think about what isn't on your schedules. And back in the 60s, and I don't mean to sound, like an old fuddy-duddy that the 60s was great and the 21st century is already crashing and burning, but there is a way in which my observation that I've tested against a number of adults who went through here in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, began to change a bit in the 90s, and with friends of mine who've had sons and daughters come through now in the 90s, there is a way in which you don't have the same amount of free time that we had. Now, that's probably perhaps obvious to you. But my memory of Harvard was long afternoons, not just on Saturdays or Sundays, but long afternoons when I'd scheduled it right, where I could wander around the square and go to different parts of the Widener stacks than I actually had to go to, have very in-depth conversations with friends about serious issues, go to the movies not on weeknights, I was fairly serious, but certainly on the weekends, and had this sense, as opposed to high school, of a vast amount of time that I could call my own. And I had a sense of choice and delight in that. And sure, there were times when you were utterly driven and you stayed up for 2 nights in a row writing something, but that was also choice, because you'd done something earlier to make it necessary. And this is a very crucial part about learning who you are and learning who your friends should be, understanding what your own mind is like, the free time that you determine to be your own. And I mean free time here for intellectual thoughts, but also free time for dreaming. And one of my favorite short stories is by a poet called Delmar Schwartz, and it's called In Dreams Begin Responsibilities. Schwartz, S-C-H-W-A-R-T-Z, Delmar Schwartz is an American Jew who committed suicide. Heavy drinker, heavy smoker, in that sort of period of Dylan Thomas and others. And brilliant poet, driven, obsessed with what was going on in Europe and the difficulties of entering the U.S. society. But in Dreams Begin Responsibilities, what he was saying is that you, at a young age and growing up, you determine who you're going to be by what you dream about and then how you fulfill those dreams. And I am struck that there isn't enough time in your schedule to dream. So that's an observation and something we don't have to talk about now, but it is something I think is important to reflect back to you about.
Thank you. Can people here in the back row? Good or higher? Good. Mm-hmm. Our next question is from Carolyn O.
Hi, Dr. Leaning. Thank you for coming. As a doctor, there are many ways in which one can choose to use one's training and talents. Was there a particular event or experience in your life that led you to make such a profound commitment to humanitarian efforts, and specifically disaster response?
Thank you. There were 2 events. And they occurred relatively late in my career, in that I had already been trained as an emergency physician, and I was working full-time at Mount Auburn Hospital as an emergency physician. And 2 events occurred in the first 2 to 3 years of my practice there that created this shift. One was an old man came in on a bitterly cold night around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening and was complaining of not feeling very well, and he smelled of alcohol. and it was busy. It was a Friday or Saturday night. I can't recall which. And at those days, the emergency department had a number of residents, maybe 3 or 4 residents. I was the only attending, the only senior doc. And then at this time of night, on a Friday or Saturday, there weren't medical students. So it was sort of lightly staffed. The usual number of good nurses. Mount Auburn has very good nurses, and did then. And so he had to wait a bit because it was busy. And then I got to him and talked to him, and he was kind of tattered and poor and smelled of alcohol and was very vague about what was bothering him. And the more I talked to him, the more I realized, and we did a couple of tests, and I looked at his vital signs and examined him. It was clear that there wasn't very much wrong with him, and he even knew that. And then as I began to say, so is somebody bothering you? Are you afraid to be outdoors? When was your last meal? He said, look, Doc, it's very cold outside, and I'm homeless. And I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go tonight. It was the start of, one of those deep December or January cold snaps. And I said, okay, well, let's figure out where you can go, because I think you're pretty much clear to go here. You're no longer needing to stay in the emergency department. And he said, but now what? So I talked to the nurses, called in the social worker, spoke to the alcohol counselor. He was not having tremendous trouble with alcohol, but I decided I'd see whoever I could find in terms of the system that might help me have it work. And at this stage in 1980-81 in Cambridge, there were very few shelters. There was no space for him, and everything was closed. And I wound up deciding that this was ridiculous. I could either have him camp out in the front waiting room, which was sort of bad precedent. I mean, I knew the head of the ED would not like it, and the nurses would be fed up with it, and I had no idea whether he would sleep or bother the people coming in, so that didn't seem like the right answer. So I basically gave him money and ordered a taxi, and a little bit against the rules, filled out a taxi voucher. You do taxi vouchers when you are deliberately sending somebody to some other place and they don't have any money. Usually the emergency departments have a little bit of spending money for a voucher. So I gave him a voucher, and I gave him money, and I told the taxi driver to take him down to the all-night movies in the combat zone. It was then the combat zone. And gave him enough money so he could do sort of reel-to-reel all night in the movie theater. Struck the nurses as a little odd. It struck me as odd, but it seemed the only thing I could do. Then the other was about 5 or 6 months later. There was a bad car accident that brought about 4 or 5 people in from a 2-car accident. And it was, in those days again, it was complicated because you had people from both sides, that is, both cars you had in a small emergency department. And everybody's on stretchers with curtains between them, but there's not a lot of privacy. And there were allegations among those that were conscious of who was responsible for what. But the problem is there weren't very many people who were that conscious. They were actually pretty desperately injured, at least 3 of the 5. And again, I was the only one on. I had to call in help. It was extremely dicey for a bit as to whether we were going to stabilize all of them in time. And I was reflecting on that and thinking, this is right on the edge of what I can cope with in terms of the volume and the staffing and the triage. And I was becoming a more experienced doc, and I thought about this. And this was just about the time, 80, 81, when the nuclear arms race was building up. And the response of the United States in its political arguments with the Soviet Union, and a similar response on the part of the Soviet Union, was to say, we're building up these massive nuclear weapons in order not to use them and to deter you from using yours, because if you use yours, then we will send ours up, and it will be mutual catastrophe. So anybody sane and rational will just sit on these weapons even as we build them up. That was the argument. That was the structure of deterrence. But both sides were beginning to get somewhat aggressive, and were saying, but in fact, even if you were to use yours and we were to use ours, we have a really good civil defense program, and we're going to be able to survive a 500 megaton attack from the Soviet Union because of all these plans we've got in place and all these emergency doctors and all of these shelter possibilities and our evacuation process and the storage capacities in the United States, we can survive it. And I was struck then by this problem of how you ramp up disaster response from a 5-person, 2-car accident to, say, a major disaster, which I was getting interested in, like hotel fires, building collapses, a bridge malfunction. How you ramp that up to a civil defense for nuclear war strategy. And I began to look into what the government plans actually were, and found that they had numerous holes and deficiencies in them. But the fundamental point here is that I became struck with the fact that as a single person doing the best I could for individuals that came into my front door as an emergency doc, I was severely handicapped by the absence of by some combination of system and social understanding that a system was necessary. And in both of these situations, homelessness and civil defense for nuclear war, there was a need for public and policymakers to be educated on the issues, and then the systems to be put in place to help individuals and whoever in the population would be assaulted by the problem. And so that started me on a path of studying disasters and studying the more global policies of arms control and the interaction between advocacy and public policy, which is a fascinating topic when you come to arms control.
Savis Sepa.
Hi there. Since one of the themes of our class is personal choice, I wanted to ask you why you chose to risk your personal safety in the field work that you do. And I also wanted to ask, was there ever a time where you had to draw the line in terms of your own safety, even though it might have helped others?
Yes, thank you. The times I have appeared to risk my life to people who may not know the environment or the cultural context into which I've said I would like to go have in general been on human rights missions. There are other times when you risk your life a little bit more instinctively. That is, something happens and you're there in response, and then you realize, ooh, that was a close one, right? But I think your question is, in the more deliberative mode, when do I make a risk-benefit assessment and then do it? And that's been usually in human rights missions. And there, the fundamental point in the last 20 years is that people from the outside who are, we call them expats, expatriates, people not of the country that is in question, are getting more and more numerous in terms of their entering the country that's in trouble. And what's becoming increasingly clear, whether you're a journalist, a humanitarian person, a UN worker, a Red Cross worker, or a human rights person, what's becoming increasingly clear is that the fact that you are first world, whether you're white or a person of color, the fact that you're first world going into third world, and I'm saying that advisedly rather than the moderate euphemism of developing world, because I think that is actually a phony phrase. We're still dealing with large areas of the world that are third world. When you go into the third world where it's torn by really big human rights abuses and, if not war, you're not safe. You can't trust the fact that people are going to say, oh, great, you've come in to help us solve your problems. That went out about 25 years ago. So you have to be fairly careful about going in there with a mission, figuring out why you're there. And in human rights, you're there to understand a problem, investigate it, make a report, and then survive to talk about it when you come out. Because your work is partly in country, partly to create the sense of connection with people who are suffering so they know what's going on is not being utterly ignored, that there are reasonable people outside the third world to whom they can have some connection and attach some hope. That's important, really important. But what you're actually fundamentally trying to leverage is the fact that when you come out, you can talk to the first world with a certain level of energy and authenticity and fact that is going to make the policy change. And you have made a bad mistake if you risk your life right up to the edge. You're sailing really close to the wind so that you get hurt or killed and you can't come out to tell the story. So the injunction I give in human rights training is survive in order to report. There's no need for any more martyrs. They don't cause a ripple. Martyrdom doesn't exist anymore in this actually quite terrible world we're in. So you have to go in and negotiate and be kind of smart. So time when it didn't work. I mean, it didn't work in the sense that I didn't get in the information. I did survive. Was in 1997 in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which was then still called Eastern Zaire. Recall there was a massive genocide in 1994, April 1994, of Rwandan Tutsis by Rwandan Hutus primarily. The denouement of that genocide, which resulted in 800,000 to 1 million people dead in a very short period of time, let's try 6 to 8 weeks, was that as the avenging Tutsi government came in from where it had been in exile in Uganda and came into the north of Rwanda and pushed the Hutu génocidaires out of Rwanda, they all piled across a very narrow isthmus of land into Eastern Zaire and got into this horrible situation of a massive refugee camp on a volcanic flat that created terrible privation for them. That refugee camp, because of its political instability and how it was fomenting and interacting with political instability in Eastern Zaire and all of Congo, was disrupted by one of the groups that was trying to challenge and gain ascendancy in the Congo. And so many, a large number of those people, somewhere between 250 and 300,000, who'd been in this camp, vanished into the bushes and into the forest of northeastern Congo. And there were at least 6 different kinds of military that were out there going against those people and against the local villagers who were ethnically, many of them ethnically, Hutu or in allied tribes. So the allegation from human rights and humanitarian groups who were hanging on by their fingernails in Eastern Zaire trying to take care of the local people and these terrified fleeing refugees in the forest, the allegation was that there were massacres of many of them in far corners of northeastern Congo. And they called for help and a human rights investigation in order to raise consciousness so that there would be an international peacekeeping force to come in and try to put an end to these massacres. So rumors of massacres up country call in a human rights set of people. We were implored by the United Nations, by the Red Cross in Washington, to go there, Physicians for Human Rights. We got a small team together. We debriefed, in other words, they told us about it, what was going on. We went to Amsterdam. We talked to some of the humanitarian groups that had field workers in Eastern Zaire, and they told us what they knew. And they implored us to go. We got into Nairobi, which is the point of departure to go into central parts of Africa. And the UN people wouldn't talk to us, the Red Cross wouldn't talk to us, and the regional headquarters for the humanitarian organizations wouldn't talk to us because they were too afraid that if human rights groups were known to go into this area and speak to the humanitarian organizations that were working there, that those humanitarian organizations would get targeted. And they couldn't even deliver milk powder, they couldn't even deliver tents, they couldn't have a vaccination program. So although there was a need for a human rights investigation, human rights is political. Humanitarian aid, at least on the face of it, is not so political. And they were afraid that we get too close and jeopardize the whole enterprise. So we maneuvered carefully and with difficulty to get into Eastern Congo, the 3 of us. Had to cross the border somewhat illegally. And once we got there, this is the town of Goma in Eastern Zaire, beat up town, really destroyed by the masses of refugees who'd come through it. Very poor, very scary. You couldn't, it's a small town, rutted roads. Some cafes, but everything mainly taking place behind shuttered gates. we were advised, don't walk from one appointment to another, half a block. Don't walk. Get a taxi, because 3 white people walking around in Goma are going to be real obvious. I thought we'd be pretty obvious in a taxi, too, for half a block. In any case, that seemed to be the advice. There was no way of communicating with people, no phones and things, so you would basically tentatively knock on these shuttered metal gates, and the guard would open, and you explain who you were, and then he might shut it. He will shut it. You go back and check inside, then he will come back and let you in or not let you in. The humanitarian organizations wouldn't meet with us except on Sunday mornings with the radio going in the back garden. They were so afraid to talk. And the gist of it is that we could not get any sense of safety about going up country to where the massacres were. It was a long green road going into the bush. There were 6 armies killing people. We couldn't get any kind of cover from the humanitarian organizations who had their white SUVs, and about every 2 weeks we'd be going up country to deliver food packages and vaccinations and medicines. They were too afraid to have a human rights person. There were roadblocks all the way. And I was the team leader of a small team of 3, and we had spent 2.5 weeks and maybe $12,000 of a small organization's money, Physicians for Human Rights. I mean, we were volunteers. It cost that much to get into these places. And I decided we had to abort the mission, that there was no safe way we could go up country and look into massacres. We did some other things that gave us some information. We learned a lot. It was not a loss. But my sense on that one is that if you can't be pretty sure that you can have a handshake with the people that are taking you up and with the people you meet along the way, that they are going to respect who you are and give you a little space to do your work. If you can't have that assurance, then you can't do human rights work. We're not in Iraq, Physicians for Human Rights. In fact, there are very few human rights groups doing anything in Iraq. It's too unsafe in general to move around. People are too wary. They don't want to talk to you. It's difficult now to even organize a human rights strategy in Afghanistan for outsiders. But in Iraq, the work that we would want to do is helping to excavate the mass graves and help to have the families of the missing identify who is in those graves. To do that, you need to be in place, visible, rope off the graves. You've got an office in a big warehouse. You've got people coming in. You've got a database. You're incredibly visible. It's too hot a thing to do right now, given what's going on. So there needs to be, even in the kind of humanitarian work I do, which is human rights work, which is edgy, it's right on the edge of things, there needs to be a certain assumption of some stability of connection with the people that you need to rely on to get the information. If you can't rely on those people, then you can't do the job.
Zach Stone.
Dr. Leaning, I have a question related to what you were just saying. You stated in your article, Public Health, War, and Terrorism, that the basic services provided in humanitarian catastrophes include food, shelter, medical supplies, and so on. And you just mentioned some other functions that aid officials might serve, such as identifying the dead in mass graves. And you also stress in your article that these services are extremely vulnerable to intervention by governments, rebels, 6 competing armies, terrorists, and so on. And so you must have experienced a great degree of personal frustration in your work in the field. And I was wondering if you could mention a time that you felt personally frustrated and how you responded to that frustration.
Well, could I just make a distinction that I didn't in particular make in that article between human rights work and humanitarian work, although your comments apply to both. Humanitarian work, this is, the way it is used in the currency now. Humanitarian work involves people who are responding to the pain and suffering of populations, and they go out and they will deliver food and water and medical supplies and maybe help with water sanitation work, agricultural work, etc. And they're likely to be in country for quite a long time and develop some roots and connections. Human rights people are there to explore violations of international law or human rights that may have occurred in the last couple of years, or might have been deeper. But you're usually going there at the invitation of one or another group, and you have to be quite careful about maintaining your own objectivity and neutrality, even if you're there to investigate an alleged abuse. And in general, it is not a good idea to be known to be in country for more than, say, 3 weeks. The authorities get tired of you. It doesn't mean even a failed state, which doesn't really have authorities, the people around include the people that want you there and the people who don't want you there. And quite rapidly, you know, the people who don't want you there begin to know who you are, and it's just unwise, okay? So we're the short-termers. We come in and we ask the tougher questions. We're moving around fast. And I would say in both human rights work and humanitarian work, the sense of frustration is a given. Both kinds of work involve pushing up a boulder uphill. It is an act of a Sisyphus, but it's also an act of defiance. It's sort of a quite complicated, systematic, sustained act of defiance. The time when so frustration is there, the third world is laced with frustration. The whole point about this is that things aren't working, that there are local and regional and international forces deliberately adding to that and ensuring that things don't work, and that there are an appalling number of people suffering. So that's the ground we're in, okay? Add to that, say, something that is worse than usual in terms of how one feels about it, would be, I would say, a time in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1991-92. When I was there looking at the care of people in hospitals in Mogadishu when there was an active war going on. And the reason I was doing this is out of a sense of heightened frustration. I mean, I couldn't believe what was going on and the fact that nobody was talking about it. The leader of Somalia was challenged and overthrown in January, February of 1991. And then the ensuing instability, the feuding among the various clans, and the flight from people because of that fighting meant that the crops weren't being planted. It also was a bad drought. This area of the Horn of Africa, drought is endemic. So one began to see a mixture of famine and conflict, which is actually quite linked in much of Africa. And by the summer of 1991, the humanitarian groups that were there were saying, we're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people who are dying, and we're facing even larger numbers who are going to die if the international community doesn't do anything. It was a very slow response to this. But what happened in November of 1991 was the outbreak of active war in the city of Mogadishu, which is on the coast. Beautiful town and city with bougainvillea and wonderful architecture and museums and many, many different religious buildings. And the people that were involved in fighting had used the previous 30 years of armament they'd gotten from either the United States or the Soviet Union. Instead of using the anti-aircraft fire at planes, nobody had a plane. These were warring guys on horses and in trucks. They would take the anti-aircraft fire at guns and level them at houses and buildings and essentially demolish these sand buildings, crumbling down on people, shooting at people with AK-47s as they're running through the streets. And these 3 hospitals that were there, that were functioning, had the most appalling casualties. And the armed bands were going in and at gunpoint telling the few doctors that were there who to treat, who not to treat. So it was a total breakdown of law and order, of medical neutrality, of medical practice. And the only reason I heard about it was that there was a New Yorker article by a guy called Raymond Bonner, who's a very well-known reporter, who wrote in Talk of the Town or something, say, is anybody paying any attention to what's happening in Somalia? It's a pretty horrible story. He was writing this out of Nairobi, where you heard news. So I called Physicians for Human Rights and said, who's going over there? And they said, well, it's not going to be easy to go over there. And I basically said, okay, sign me up. I got another colleague. It turns out we couldn't do it together. We did it sequentially and went there and wrote a report. It was complicated. It was risky. That was maybe one of the closer ones in terms of a risk-benefit analysis. But we came out and managed to get the story out about what was going on in Mogadishu in that war, and it's one of the few reports that looks at casualty assessment, medical neutrality, and the heroism of local doctors in a city under conflict that's ever come out in the last 20 years. So it was worth it. And it was because my frustration was A, that it was happening, and B, that nobody was writing about it. What I find very, very difficult to endure is that people are suffering or dying and nobody's paying attention.
So, Tamiko Surudomi.
While serving others in international communities who suffer from a variety of physical, mental, and spiritual ailments, what lifestyle changes have you been required or perhaps volunteered to make in order to most effectively work with these people? And how did you handle these changes? And also, what sacrifices, quote unquote, have you had to make? Thank you.
Well, one needs to try to be physically fit, because the travel and then the in-country travel, it requires you to be able to carry things and live with very little supports. And that's something that, so I have an old running injury on one knee, and it's requiring me to spend more time than I might have on physical rehab, and it's not so that I can come to class and talk. It's because so that this summer I can go on a human rights mission, because I know I have to be in shape to do it. So there's sort of a bar there on paying attention to your physical capacities. The sacrifices now are not so apparent, but over the last 25 years, it is not a particularly well appreciated, understood, or rewarded career path to be a part-time emergency doc and a part-time human rights investigator. You're in standard Harvard medicine, emergency medicine, up until about 10 or 15 years ago, was considered really transgressive. I mean, when I told my chief of medicine at Mass General in 1975, as I finished my internship, that I wanted to go into emergency medicine, they couldn't believe it. And there wasn't a residency there. There was a fellowship I took for a year, and then I took sort of a rotating fellowship, and then I went to Mount Auburn, and then finally in 1984, they developed a college and you could start taking boards. Now, for those of you who are going to medicine, you understand this sort of. In other words, I decided to do something that wasn't even on the path. It wasn't by myself, but there weren't many of us. And it's still not considered a particularly respectable branch of medicine in the Harvard medical hierarchy. So that's one thing. The other is human rights was not on the radar screen until, we founded Physicians for Human Rights in 1986. So again, this was well into my persistence with it. Now, both of these arenas are becoming more respected and more central to much of the work that is going on in the world. And so I feel very gratified and very fulfilled. So I guess one thing I'd say is it's not always going to make sense for 20 or 25 years. That you should be going with what you really think is important, what a few colleagues agree with you about, what you love doing. And you may not get immediate, career awards or a lot of recognition for it. But in day to day or week to week or at least month to month, you can look back on it and say, well, what I say is, if I had to die tomorrow, would it have felt okay? And so far, so good. In terms of the particular choice that mixes emergency medicine and human rights, it's hard to have a family. I mean, I have a close partner and very happy personally. I think it would have been very difficult to do it with children. It's not to say it can't be done, but I know when we're choosing our teams to go places, Mogadishu, Somalia, DRC, Afghanistan, you know, when the war was still winding down, people with children are not signing up for this. Because even though one is, I care very much about staying alive. It's not that I am willing to, as we've just talked about, risk things that are excessive. But you are in a higher risk environment than Harvard Square. And people who have children have a sense of an umbrella of responsibility that they I think, stops. It doesn't mean that you couldn't do it later in life. In other words, when your children were more grown or when you felt you could make these decisions. And I've had a number of conversations with friends who now have children who are 18, 19, 25, and they are beginning to look at this set of international investigations as something they want to do. I think that's pretty much how it plays out, though, in terms of sacrifices and personal choice.
Blake, polarize.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experiences with situations in which public health initiatives don't line up with religious or cultural values. For example, I'm from Miami, which is a largely Catholic community, and things like safe-sex contraception are just not, they're stigmatized. And I was wondering if you could talk about your experience with that, how you grapple with, that conflict.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It helps in this conflict to have some understanding of what the consensus is in the human rights community about some of these issues that can be framed as cultural values or culturally relative practices. I tend to subscribe to a view of the world that is enshrined in those documents that would suggest that everybody is deserving of, by being human, everybody is deserving of an equal chance, not just at the time of birth, but every instant you see them. So you treat them as another. You treat them as somebody that is as plausible, as powerful, as autonomous, and is imbued with dignity as you would consider yourself to be. So that is for men and women and for all ranges of classification that one might want to throw at that. Secondly, as a physician, I subscribe to a number of tenets of medical ethics, a very major one being do no harm. That, as you may already know, is not easy to operationalize. In fact, doesn't get operationalized that exactly. Any action you do has side effects and may cause harm, but you're weighing the risks and benefits. And essentially what you're trying to do under do no harm is do good and minimize harm. And that then puts me in a certain point of standing and equilibrium when it comes to issues around safe sex or female cutting or Sharia law around punishment of people who have been robbers that in certain settings can wind up in an injunction that their hand get cut off. And this is where a human rights and a public health / medical perspective actually ground you. And you have opinions about them and observe them and document them if they occur in the setting of a human rights investigation. In a one-on-one setting, if I am there to accomplish something and I see something going on that I think I don't agree with, it varies a great deal as to whether I'm going to say anything about it. Generally speaking, in human rights work, you don't try to change what you're seeing. You're documenting and reporting on it, and you come back and you try to do this at a system level and an education level. You can't wear out the graciousness of who and the courageousness of whoever you're talking to, whether you agree with them or not, by then injecting your own point of view about something. So and that's also true in medical practice. Unless somebody is asking you to do something that you think is profoundly wrong or profoundly illegal, you let a lot of conversation go by and give a lot of latitude to people, and you try to edge them and persuade them into healthier or more reasonable stances. So I am not in the business of advocating along major moral and cultural fault lines, except, as I say, in the documents I write or in the public processes I'm committed to, say, giving testimony in Congress or debriefing the Defense Department. Now, and I can't think of an exception to that. I know that one of the ways where I've found some people that are a little irritated about this is in the humanitarian community, where there's been this big debate about what to do with Sharia law or what to do about female cutting, and the human rights communities and the humanitarian communities are somewhat at odds on this. But I can go into those details if you'd like.
Sharon Ronan has our last question.
Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Leaning. As I was reminded in your article, we live, quote, within a global context of contested and limited resources, end quote. As a physician, what perspective or particular concerns do you bring to this essential conversation about how to best utilize and distribute our resources?
Well, I think it begins with consciousness and awareness, which is one reason this course is very important. We have, over the last 50 years since the end of the Second World War, we, that is, people in the United States and in the West or the First World, have accentuated the gap between the rich and the poor, and the gap in future potential, the gap in any sustainable sense of hope. We have accelerated that markedly since 1945. In other words, we have developed in a large number of ways, and much of the world has moved very little. So the relative disproportion has gotten worse. And yes, the world has gotten more crowded, and it has gotten much more complicated than it was post-World War II. There's no question about that, just in terms of demographic change and the issues that we're dealing with and the rapidity with which people now understand what's going on in terms of global communications. But the fundamental points remain that there are an unacceptable number of people dying young and an unacceptable number of women dying in childbirth. And similarly, we can go down through all the indices around health and water and food and education. And hope, I'd say, expectation that one can have a reasonable life and can be secure in that life and have children and feel okay about yourself. That is not a set of expectations that large parts of the world can remotely hope to aspire to. So just realizing that differential is, first of all, the most important aspect of starting the next phase, which is, what are you going to do about it? And I would submit that whether you want to be a rock musician or a physician or a nuclear physicist, part of what somebody coming out of Harvard must be challenged to say to himself or herself is, how is this going to make the world better for all these people who have very little? I'm not speaking about another Albert Schweitzer initiative. The world's more complicated. Figuring out where you're fitting in and then keeping an edge of discomfort all the time in your mind and in your heart and in your reading and in your interactions is, to me, the essential part of being in this world now. We have no excuse not to recognize that we are unutterably privileged. And whatever, Hindu or Buddhist flick of the wheel or charm or fate meant that you were born here and not in many parts of the world that I'm speaking about. Whatever that flick of fate is, doesn't give you any reason to think that they matter less than you do. So that's what I would be saying. Do things that make what I just said seem real to you. Travel, dream, read, go to the movies that are increasingly getting good about bringing these people home to you. And don't forget that all the sacrifice that your family has put behind you and all the work that you have done to be here, an enormous amount of work. I respect it. I respect it so deeply. I know how hard it is to be here and to succeed here. All that enterprise, all that sacrifice, all that work is not going to amount to anything at the end of the time when your life is shut out if you can't also say, I did this for others as well. There's a line in Yeats's autobiography which struck me. It's just unbelievable. And this is sort of a mixed message because I think Yeats, through his writing, has affected the lives of generations of us on this planet. But he said in his autobiography, as he was sort of getting through it, got it about two-thirds way, he said, as I think of all the work and hope and life and love that was poured into me by my grandparents and my parents and my friends and my teachers, and of all the work that I have done, and I look at what I have accomplished, it feels to me as if my life amounts to very little. Now, part of that is he was somewhat depressed. Part of that is that he was being somewhat manipulative. He knew damn well that he'd done a lot. And part of it was, to me, it said that this was a man who had an ambition always to be changing the world as well as doing his craft. And he wasn't sure he'd gotten the balance right. I might have said to him, Yeats, I think you got the balance right. But that tension between who you are and who you are for others, I think is an essential part of being alive today.
Dr. Jennifer Leaning, for giving us a model of sustained courage in the service of love. We thank you.